The topic of their presentation is Lights, Camera, Action. The time to quantify climate risk is now. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Joseph Hoang-Luu and James Manton-Hall. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Andreas, for taking the time to present a very colorful biography for both myself and James. We do like to present ourselves as individuals more so than our credentials, which as consultants, you may expect us to present our credentials, but that will come in due time. So for today's presentation, we are focusing on our experience providing climate risk analysis to the clients across Australia and Asia Pacific. Both James and myself are dedicated actuaries that perform 100% of our time to climate risk analysis. And today's focus is not going to be on anything technical, but more so about our experience being able to deliver advice to our stakeholders successfully and what lessons we needed to learn to be able to do that, which has been learnings and a transformation from our usual experience, speaking with other actuaries or insurance professionals who are very well versed in physical risk. So without further ado, we'll step straight into it. To begin, we want to set the scene to talk about the difference of qualitative climate risk analysis and quantitative climate risk analysis. This is important because a lot of the work that we've been able to provide to our clients has been quantitative, and it really sets the scene on where we're trying to operate and where we think actuaries are well placed to operate. So to begin, on the qualitative side, this type of modeling is not necessarily linked to validated data sources. And it also is more coarse in its output. Typically, you'd see red, amber, green ratings. They tend to be limited in their ability to inform business decisions, although they're much quicker to implement, and it's an easy entry point for many organizations. And they can also be delivered equally by non-actuaries and actuaries. I'll hand over to James to talk about some of the quantitative elements.
Thanks, Joe. And when we're working with a number of the organisations, which Joe will talk about in a moment's time, often these organisations come from quite a non-technical background, and their level of maturity in climate risk modelling is sort of several generations behind what we might expect from the insurance industry when we're looking more at sort of corporate clients that don't have those modelling specialties in-house. So that's often where they are currently when we look at qualitative type analysis of climate risk. What we try to help them to do is to uplift them on a journey towards quantitative analysis. And as you can see from the comparison, those lists, that obviously looks quite different. It's much more grounded in evidence, science, engineering, economics. The outputs which can come out of that analysis is a lot more granular. They are able to inform business decisions in a way that's a lot more practical once there are numbers behind things to inform decision makings. And it also requires a journey to uplift organisational understanding of climate risk from the sort of level that they're sometimes at from an entry standpoint. And then finally, I think this is where actuaries are well placed to deliver climate risk analysis, even in non-traditional fields, so outside of the world of insurance, where we might typically play, given that we've got those skills to make things quantitative, where organisations might currently be looking at things through a qualitative lens.
And as promised, we will talk about our credentials as KPMG consultants. We won't indulge in this too much because there is some valued content to present as well. But here you see on the page of blurred logos, the type of clients that we deliver to globally across our many partner firms around the world. The tool that we do use, we call it Climate IQ, and we've been delivering it to our clients since 2021. And our KPMG firm employs actuaries that are solely dedicated to applying their skill sets to quantifying climate risk. Our clients have ranged across a broad number of sectors beyond the traditional sectors that actuaries have played in the past, including consumer goods, food and agriculture, infrastructure, energy, services, and transportation, to name a few.
Thanks, Joe. So as Joe mentioned in the intro, what we'll be focusing on today is a few lessons learned out of working with these non-traditional actuarial organizations across those range of different corporate industries that Joe mentioned. The four sort of key points we'll be touching on throughout are firstly buy-in. So how do we get different organizations to buy into sort of what is quite complex modeling and things that they may not be so familiar with. The second is language. So looking at how we change how we talk about climate risk and how we talk about technical modeling concepts to apply to audiences that aren't from a technical actuarial background or a technical modeling background. The third is capability, which is about how we leverage existing capability, whether that's from the insurance world or within organizations themselves, to make the quality of the modeling and climate risk analysis that we do more effective. And then finally is to look at some examples of when we do have clients that might be a bit more advanced, a bit more entrepreneurial than the standard, and looking at how we can help them to sort of push the boundaries and look at analysis that's a bit more sophisticated. As we go through these, we'll have a couple of sort of role plays just to keep it a bit lively, and I'll bring Joe back at this point to help with that.
Hi, James. Our organization is Climate Pro. I even removed the plastic film on coffee cups to recycle.
High value client, that's amazing. That's going a step further than the average client does.
So we already do our part for the community. Thanks for your offer of assistance though.
We can assist with more than meticulous recycling though. Did you know that we can also assist you with some climate modeling? And this is the first takeaway that we have around how we get buy-in from clients to buy into the journey of climate risk. I think the first thing that came out of the conversation there is it's important to acknowledge where organizations already are sort of, you know, with best endeavors putting themselves out there and putting out decarbonization strategies or any sort of climate strategies in their organization. The second key way in which we have seen sort of getting buy-in from stakeholders over time is to break climate modeling down into smaller and sort of more approachable bite-sized chunks that they're able to interact with in a way that they can understand, rather than sort of approaching them with what might be a very complex set of modeling approaches. So this, what's on screen here is an example schematic or flow diagram that we often use to talk about Climate IQ, which is one of the climate modeling solutions that we offer, and to sort of talk clients through how each individual step in the process or each individual component works in a way that they can understand, and build that up to an overall picture to ensure that they are on board with the process. So looking at this diagram, Climate IQ is a climate scenario analysis tool looking at both physical and transition risk. So the sort of steps that we've broken this into are in the first box in the top left is a scenario selection. So that's where different future pathways are defined, and this draws upon the previous presentation in terms of the RCP pathways, for example, but rather than talking about it through the lens of RCP scenarios, which they may not be familiar with, talking about them through just temperature, global warming, and through decarbonisation. So each of the scenarios we'll talk about as being associated with a particular temperature pathway. So for example, 4 degrees of warming through to 2100 or 2 degrees of warming through to 2100. And we associate that with what the global greenhouse gas emissions might be under any of those different scenarios. We then chunk up the sort of physical analysis and the transition risk analysis separately. So in the second box there is where we look at physical climate risk analysis. So that's where we have the sorts of climate models and projections that were talked about previously. In that example there, it's an example of cyclone pathways simulated under different climate scenarios moving forward, but obviously also covers other types of acute and chronic perils as well. In the third box down the bottom, we look at transition risk or macroeconomic changes across the economy under each of those different future climate scenarios. When we think about that macroeconomic variable, macroeconomic modeling, there's a very complex macroeconomic model which underpins, or computable generalized equilibrium model which underpins the transition analysis that we do. But we break that down for clients into individual outputs of things that they might be able to relate to easily. So things like we will be modeling the GDP in different countries moving forward under each of these different scenarios. And then at an individual sector or individual commodity level, we might model things like what are the air transport prices in different countries, or what are the electricity prices in different countries, to really break down that modeling to things which are very tangible and easy to see how they might apply to their business. And then finally on the right there, that's where we apply the sort of physical risk modeling in box 2 there, and then economic modeling in box 3 to a specific client to understand how those changes might impact their business. And that's where they're more familiar with their operations and how they might be impacted. So that tends to be something that they can relate to a bit more. So I guess the takeaway from this is when we do climate modeling, it can be very complex, and it can be a lot for people that don't have a modeling background, but breaking it down into individual steps and expressing those steps in ways that that are easy to understand and are quite tangible is really important for getting the buy-in from stakeholders that this analysis is needed and useful.
And I think Nigel might be happy to hear that in box 2, we mainly use climate conditioned vendor models. So rest assured, Nigel, we are using the models that you endorse.
Moving on then to language. So this is going further down the line of how do we talk to clients about complex modeling issues. So when we think about sort of heavy tail distributions, we think about catastrophe distributions. They're obviously things that we're all very familiar with as actuaries, but might be harder to grasp as non-mathematical or non-actuaries that sit within these corporate organizations. So when we're trying to get the concept of these heavy tail distributions that we're dealing with across to clients, it can sometimes be quite challenging. The sort of questions that we might commonly get asked are if we're projecting the damage to a particular asset, and we're projecting that the expected loss for that particular asset, or the average loss, mean loss for that particular asset is a certain level, but they say, well, actually, we've never had anything that comes close to that level of loss in the sort of 10 years since we built this asset, then that can be sort of quite challenging for people to get their heads around. And so the way that we approach that is to try and express these sort of quite complex mathematical problems through more simple analogies. So the example that we have on the screen here is one that we've used previously to talk to clients about sort of how mean is different to the full distribution, particularly when we're talking about sort of heavy tail distributions. And it's to say, if you have a dice that has the normal 1 to 5 side, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on 5 sides, but then instead has 105 on the other level, and we've picked that so that there's a nice mean, then even though the mean of the dice is 20, even though you only are going to exceed 20 once every so often. And so that's showing that, yes, you can have things where you might have an event which is really big, but quite rare. And therefore, once you average out across the full distribution, you might be getting something that you haven't actually experienced before in the average year. That's a physical risk example of how we use analogies. When we're looking at transition risk, there are also ways in which analogies can play a role. So when we're thinking about things like macroeconomic modeling of transition scenarios, those models will tend to introduce policies like carbon taxation or carbon offset schemes to look at how those policies are likely to flow through the economy, both in terms of decarbonisation, but then also in terms of the macroeconomic effects throughout the model. And those interactions can get quite complex. And we work closely with economists to work through those different trends, but we can look at things like first order impacts when you have a tax applied to, say, the generation of coal that's very emissions intensive. Then that gets passed through to electricity prices and electricity generation, which gets passed through to different industries that are using electricity, which gets passed through to their end customers. And then that might change the level of supply and demand at sort of a very downstream level throughout the economy. So those interactions are quite difficult to work through. One of the ways that we try to get clients on board with those type of complex macroeconomic interactions is through simple analogies of things that might be more tangible to them. So when we're talking about things like smoking taxes, for example, if you have a smoking tax, it might operate in a very similar way to a carbon tax in many regards. There's an immediate effect of having some taxation money that's generated, but then there's flow-on sort of effects throughout the rest of society. So you might have a smoking tax that's implemented, then you have the rate of smoking within society starts to decline as people's preferences change because the price of cigarettes are going up. Once that starts to happen, then there's a subsequent downstream effect that people's health might start to go up because they're not smoking as much, and then they might be able to exercise more, for example, and then that might have a flow-on effect to having sort of happier outcomes in home because people are healthier. So there's quite a significant jump from the starting point of introducing a smoking tax to the end point, but there are sort of clear links throughout the chain to show how one might lead to the other, in a similar way to how introducing carbon taxes can have seemingly distant but actually quite related outcomes across the economy. The next point that we wanted to talk to about learnings from some of the climate analysis we've delivered is about leveraging capability. So this can apply both to leveraging our existing capability or the insurance industry's existing capability, us as actuaries' existing capability in sort of modelling techniques. And it can also apply to leveraging capability from, say, within client organisations, which might not be related to climate risk, for example, but still could be relevant to building out those models of their organisation and how climate might affect them. So the example that we've got here is about leveraging existing insurance catastrophe models. So we've heard previously quite a bit of detail about what those catastrophe models look like in terms of GCMs, RCMs, but also when we're thinking about just insurers doing pricing, the sort of current day catastrophe models that they use, that's a capability which is relevant outside the insurance industry as well. So leveraging those existing insurance models and updating them with forward-looking climate data allows us to have that view of what event sizes or insurance claims might be for an organisation into the future as well. So it's not something that might typically be applied through in this way, but it's a capability that we're able to pick up and sort of use and leverage to move forward into the future. So that's an example of leveraging actuaries' capability or existing modelling capability. There are also examples of us being able to use capability internally, as I mentioned. So one example of that is when we are working with some electricity distribution clients, which we have worked with quite extensively. Some of them will have some internal models which are network connectivity models. So looking at how electricity flows throughout their network. Now those models aren't built for the purposes of climate risk analysis. However, if we're able to leverage that capability to combine it with a view of climate risk across their network, then we can come up with some quite powerful results because we can understand if there is sort of a climate event, not just which their assets are impacted, but how does that affect the flow of electricity all the way across their network. So the takeaway here is that there are capabilities both within our skill set that can be applied elsewhere, and also capabilities within some sort of client organizations or corporate organizations, which will be very relevant to modeling their climate risk. And finally, to talk about entrepreneurial clients, we'll bring Joe back for another role play.
Hi, James. Can you please provide the climate risk analysis at an individual asset level?
High value client? Yes, I can, but please consider the following. So what we've got represented here are essentially a QQ plot showing model fit at a overall asset portfolio level on the left. And then what happens to the fit of those models if you break that down to models on the 8 individual assets in the portfolio to the right. Unsurprisingly, once we model things at sort of a whole portfolio level, the fit of those models tends to be a lot better because you've got sort of variances and sort of errors or biases across the portfolio being averaged out at a full portfolio level, compared to if you look at those models on an individual asset basis, in which case they tend to be a less good fit and there tends to be more bias and more errors in those modeling. So often clients will be interested in seeing the most granular possible level results down to individual asset level. However, and we can provide those. However, it's important to communicate this concept to them in a way that is really clear and ensures that the outputs are being used in ways that are appropriate for their decision-making purposes. So ensuring that we can effectively explain to them the sort of concept of the increasing errors or decreasing reliability of the models at individual asset levels, and explaining to them what that might mean for their decision-making process is a really important part. What we don't want is them to take results at an individual asset level, take those as truth, and then go away and make decisions purely off those. What we'd instead encourage is that those results, as you start to go more granular and there is more model error, that they start to be taken just as one data point in a much broader decision-making framework. And for example, you might want to also consult individual asset owners or asset managers to get their views on exposure to different perils at individual asset sites before you make any investment decisions on the back of that.
Hi, James. I noticed that the model did not explicitly allow for shark attacks, and that may occur due to rising sea levels. Can we please add this into the model?
High value client? Yes, we can, but please consider the following. In order for there to be shark attack injuries or deaths, there have to be a few things that happen. So firstly, there has to be heavy rainfall. That has to lead to a flood or rising sea levels. Then there have to be sharks that come in with those rising sea levels or flood waters. And then you have to have someone that is attacked or injured by those sharks. So once we sort of take the product of those probabilities and have A, B, C, D% probability of someone being impacted by a shark, then that likelihood might be quite low. So essentially what, obviously this is a bit of a facetious example, but what we're trying to capture here is that often when clients are very familiar with their own assets or their own operations, there'll be very specific things which they might think about that are important to them or their role within the organization, but may not be material at an overall modeling perspective. And there is already a lot of complexity and a lot of uncertainty that comes into these climate risk models. So introducing more by trying to capture things that are potentially not going to be material or not the core level of their exposure is not always adding value. So it's important to be able to talk through with the client what is going to be most material within the considerations, what can be generalized or simplified within the model, because we can't 100% reflect real life.
Hi, James. The CGE model projects a reduction in our product sales price. Can the model allow for an increase in prices at the expense of sales volume?
high-value client? Yes, we can, but please consider the following. So when we are looking at the economic modeling and looking at supply-demand trends, we're typically looking at how overall regions and sectors will perform. Because we're using global economic models, we have to, I guess, stop somewhere in the granularity chain. It would be too loud or too noisy a model to try and model everything down to individual products or individual companies, for example, at a global level. So we have to stop that modeling at a reasonable point, and that is to only model down to sort of individual sectors or groups of related sectors within the economy. And so typically what we'll do is to basically understand what sectors the client is operating in and say that their performance is likely to be sort of correlated or related to the performance of those sectors that they're operating in. However, that may not always be the case. As Joe has alluded to in that previous question, there might be instances where clients think that they can, I guess, differentiate themselves from the sectors they're operating in, that they have a bit more price control, for example, than the other products in their market. But that is something which is quite difficult to model consumer preferences for individual products a long way into the future. So for example, they might say at the moment, Apple has differentiated itself from the broader smartphone market, and therefore they might have more pricing power. But when we're doing projections a long way into the future, it's difficult to know what that market might look like in 15, 20, 30 years' time. And so it's important that if we are going to sort of model any sort of price power or market differentiation for an individual company, and we're going to defer from the sort of sector and regional modeling that comes out of the global economic model, that those assumptions are very clearly stated and very clearly able to be defended. Otherwise, it's potentially opening up areas where you can have results which are not necessarily defensible and able to be adjusted based off individual companies' assumptions. That covers the four key areas that we wanted to touch on. Sort of learnings we've had from working with these non-insurance clients on climate risk. So how do we get buy-in? How do we ensure we can communicate effectively? How can we ensure that entrepreneurial clients get what they are looking for, and that we make sure we leverage the capabilities of the actuary profession and also the capability of our clients? Hopefully, the analogies throughout this have given some good context or good examples of the sorts of things that we deal with when dealing with non-technical clients, and people can take those lessons forward into their work with similar industries as well. Joe, any final comments from you before any questions?
Yeah, my closing comments is encouraging actuaries globally to participate in this emerging area of risk. It is an area of study that will satisfy your desire to have purpose, intellectual challenge, and it's also a fun place to work. So that will be my closing comment.
Thank you, Joseph, and thank you, James, for this lively and interactive presentation, sharing insights with us that you have learned along the way while serving some clients. And I'm sure you will be continuing to learn, and future clients will benefit from this and be able to impress whoever they have to impress, be it regulators or shareholders. So thanks for that. I also enjoyed the refreshingly different introduction, not by way of biography, but by way of personality traits. I enjoyed that too. Still waiting for the audience to ask questions. Dear participants, now is the time to ask KPMG Australia. If you ask them next week, they're going to charge you. Okay, one question has come in from the previous speaker. So here's his revenge, Nigel Winspear's revenge. He's got a question for Joseph. What sort of timescales are the majority of your clients interested in?
That's a really good question. And I'll start with, firstly, all our clients, we recommend to have a baseline view of what their risk is today. And the purpose of that is so that they get comfort around calibration. They'll have an assessment of what their risk is today. And so we need to calibrate to today's conditions. And it's not so that we can target their expectations, because as you would have seen in the DICE example, sometimes a client will have anecdotal experience, which doesn't really align with the true expectation of potential loss. But it's all about education and getting buy-in on the current day situation. Further into the future, there are a couple of flex points that we try to target. 2050 is one that's common, and as you alluded to, Nigel, it's 2040 to 2050 is where those climate models will show some divergence between the future climate scenarios. So that initial flex point is an area of interest. And further out into the future, it really depends on the clients. But some clients, for example, have assets that they hold for 70 years, 50 years, before the life cycle of the asset needs to be replaced. And that tends to be a decision point for where to model as well. It's essentially at what point do they replace assets?
Thank you for the question, Nigel. Thank you for the answer, Joseph.